All right, I think we have a lot of people connected, so I think we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and a very welcome to our webinar today. We are here to tackle a critical challenge, which is how to mobilize the massive financial resources that are needed to protect our planet's biodiversity and make nature thrive. Specifically, today we are focusing on the Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 19, which is the goal to mobilize $200 billion per year for biodiversity, which was adopted in 2022. My name is Aurora Udino. I'm a Global Environmental Finance Fellow working with the United Nations Development Programme Biodiversity Finance Initiative. And I'm very honored to facilitate this webinar today, which is titled Public-Private Finance Flowing into the Global Biodiversity Framework Target 19, Trends and Innovation. This session is part of our broader efforts under the GEF Global Biodiversity Framework Early Action Support Project, but also the Public-Private Community of Practice for Nature and Development Finance under the Revenues for Nature initiative, which is led by the Green Finance Institute with UNDP Biofin and UNEP-FI. So we all know that this past year has been very much focused on finance. We saw this topic taking the main floor at the key conferences of the parties on climate, biodiversity, and desertification. So the focus of our session today will be really to explore the current landscape of public-private finance for biodiversity, focusing on innovative financial mechanisms to support finance for biodiversity. I'm very sure you are all familiar and expert with Zoom by now, but so let me just cover some important logistical aspects very quickly. So simultaneous interpretation is available in French and in Spanish. And by the way, thank you so much to our interpreters for being with us today. If you want to activate interpretation, you can click on the icon that shows the word on the screen at the bottom of your screen, and then you can choose your preferred language. If you wish to change language for interpretation during the webinar, this is possible. You may click again the icon. And now if you would like to follow the session in English, please select the English language button. I would also like to recommend speakers and participants to speak slowly. This facilitates our interpreters' job. Lastly, if you have any technical issues, we have two colleagues that are helping out. We have Martina Echanitz and Camila Rosales, who can support. Finally, the webinar is recorded. It will be made available on the NBZAP forum with today's presentation in different languages. We will also share all the information with you today that are shared today by email after the webinar concludes. And if you want to access past webinar session, you can navigate also the NBZAP webpage, and my colleague will also drop the link in the chat as well. I see a lot of people connecting, and yes, feel free to introduce yourself and maybe mention where you are connected from. Thank you. I will just walk very briefly through the agenda of today. We have a very exciting lineup of speakers coming from different geographical areas and different type of organizations. I'm personally very excited. We'll begin with a context setting by our colleague from UNEP-FI, who will introduce the Revenues for Nature project and its community of practice. Next, we will go to the introduction on the topic by Nonde Sicilima, who is coming from the Securities and Exchange Commission in Zambia. We will then have 4 very practical cases on financial mechanism, mobilizing public-private finance. This mechanism come both from UNDP and UNEP expertise, but we have also invited external speakers to have a very broad conversation and to share innovative finance solution. So we will have speakers focusing on innovative finance for primary forest conservation, biodiversity credits, debt instruments, and payment for ecosystem services. We will have a final Q&A at the end where you are welcome to take the floor, but also please feel free to add any comments or any question you may have during the presentation in the chat. The speakers, the colleagues are welcome to reply to your comments in the chat. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Aurelia Blin from UNEP-FI, who will provide some quick remarks on the context of this webinar and the Revenues for Nature project and its community. Please, Aurelia, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first gathering of the public-private community of practice for nature and development finance this year. So this is the first gathering in a series, and this one is in a format of a webinar. So it's bringing together to the early action support project that you are probably familiar with, but also the revenues for nature project. And the aim of this project and this community is really try to align so the public and private finance and really focusing on bridging between national biodiversity strategy and action plans and private capital deployments, so UNEP-FI and UNDP Biofin and the Green Finance Initiative. So we are bringing actors from the private side in this effort to create the bridge. So I think today we somehow lucky because we are just after a momentum from COP16 in February last month in Rome, as you surely know about it, where the 200 country, nearly 200 could agree on the strategy to mobilize at least the $200 billions annually by 2030. So it's a great momentum, and we know also that central to this strategy that has been approved is the creation of place-based partnership between governments, the private sector, and when I say private sectors, I mean so the banks, the asset and the fund manager, the impact investors, the private foundation and family office, where they do have the funds and looking at pipelines to invest into it, and last but not least, also to bring indigenous people and local actors in really in the center of those bridging that we are trying to create with these webinars and the community of practice. And we also targeting on developing markets, an emerging market, which is a bit of more challenge for the private investor due to the high risk that they are exposed to. So for today, we have come to focus on 4 key trends and innovations in the public-private finance space when it comes to capital flowing into GBF target 19. And those trends and innovation that we decided to focus respond also to a sense of urgency and also sizing upcoming opportunities. So the first one is about really driving scalable, high integrity conservation solution for rainforest. And we know that those ecosystems are very vital for stabilizing the global weather systems and halting biodiversity loss. And that's going to be a political central topics at COP13 this year, later in Belém. It's about also boosting the biodiversity credit market. When I say boosting, it comes also with the opportunity for fostering indigenous-led biodiversity credit schemes. So that's exciting to hear that the model already exists. It's about also innovating in the capital market, and the list of nature-linked instruments is also expanding with more themes, loans and bonds such as nature's blue, biodiversity, what water, not to mention all the animal type that also emerging. And there is also the debt for nature swaps as a tools. And today we are going to focus on debt instruments for conservation, so with the example of the Bahamas one. And it's also about incentivizing market-based payment for ecosystem services. And luckily, we have a good example with the China's eco compensation payment for ecosystem services. So I'm looking forward to the exchange today as part of this community of practice. And hopefully that's the first step in the series of events that can bring us together. Aurora, I think the floor is back to you now.
Yes, thank you so much, Aurelia, for your words and for indeed providing a bit of background related to the context and also the topics that we will explore today. So now I would like to hand it over to Nonde Sicilima. He's the Director of Market Supervision and Development at the Securities and Exchange Commission of Zambia. He will provide his introductory remarks to help us deep dive into the topic of public-private finance to innovative mechanism towards the achievement of Target 19. Please, Nonde, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Aurora. Just to confirm that you can hear me clearly?
Yes, very clear.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is around the world, from wherever you're joining us. It is a great pleasure to speak to all of you and connect with you on this passionate topic that concerns the preservation of our biodiversity. As you may understand, GBF Target 19 is quite important because it looks at how we direct financial resources towards projects that help us achieve sustainable outcomes to preserve our biodiversity. Globally, the estimate in terms of the funding gap is anywhere between $600 million to anything just slightly above $1 billion. So it does really point to the fact that there is need to mobilize financial resources towards biodiversity. As a country, we are yet to establish what that figure is, but I do strongly suspect that it's probably in the billions of dollars. So it's something that all of us are quite alive to. As a country, biodiversity for us is also not just an environmental issue, but it's also an economic issue, because we are one of those countries that still need to develop as a country and rely heavily on our biodiversity. For example, our agriculture, our fisheries, our forestries are all essential elements of our economy. So this topic that we are tackling today just does ring home for all of us. One of the critical things, I come from the public sector, so I don't come from mainstream government, but from a policy level, one of the tasks that we have is to ensure that there's policy inconsistency in terms of creating an enabling environment for this. On the other side, we also have financial stability issues that we have to bear in mind. So from a regulatory point of view, the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, our role is to create an enabling environment for the raising of capital through the capital markets, and making sure that in the process, investors are well protected, and we are building confidence in the capital markets in terms of ensuring that the markets operate in an orderly way. Allow me to also touch briefly on the importance of collaborations. I did try to greet everyone across various time zones. And that does speak to the importance of collaboration, because we are meeting as a global village, as we like to call it. But locally, we have decided to meet as a local financial sector players to make sure that in terms of greening the financial sector, we are doing these efforts collaboratively through what we are calling the Green Finance Mainstreaming Working Group. And it comprises of 3 financial sector regulators: capital markets, banking and financial services, and the Pensions and Insurance Authority. And we've also co-opted a number of institutions outside of that, from the Ministry of Finance, Ministries of Green Economy, and Ministries of Natural Resources. So one of the things that we've been able to achieve this, just to showcase the impact that collaboration can have, is we've been able to issue green bonds guidelines through which we were able to issue the first green bonds ever in Zambia through a company known as CEC Renewables for $150 million. So their target is to actually raise 200 million. But what that has done for our market is it has shown that it's possible to have an instrument locally that can be targeted towards achieving sustainable outcomes. So we are watching this space. We do have a lot of interest from other players that are trying to emulate this example and also follow suit in terms of issuing green bonds or other sustainable finance instruments. I also just wanted to pay tribute to UNDP Biofin, who have also been our key partner in terms of some of the projects that we are doing. And one of them that's quite topical to finance is one of the things that we're doing is the development of a green finance strategy. So basically, how do we, as a nation, intend to ensure that we have a proper strategy for mobilizing resources that will go towards greening the Zambian financial services. Other collaborations that we're doing is also enhancing our reporting. So our tagging and reporting frameworks, our green taxonomies, all these are just meant for us to make sure that as a jurisdiction, we are ready when we call something green, it is green. It's also targeted towards biodiversity. So I really hope that that has given context in terms of NBSAPs, how important biodiversity is, how important collaborations are, just make sure that we are not working in silos. So it would be great to hear from the other speakers and to share ideas in terms of how we ensure that we are meeting the GBF Target 19 of mobilizing resources for biodiversity preservation. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Nonde, and indeed you provide a great background and context and also very practical examples on what is Zambia doing to greening its financial system and beyond. I would so now we already started to dive from the what was our goal, the target 19, and reach this biodiversity finance goal. And now we will continue to deep dive into the how. So I would like to invite and give the floor to Ashley Kamhai. She's the Director of Innovative Finance, Forests and Climate and at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And she will give a presentation on innovative finance for primary forest conservation using the HI4 case studies as a practical example.
Great, so, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aurora. Great, next slide. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. I am thrilled and super grateful to be here to share with you about the HI4 initiative. HI4 stands for the High Integrity Forest Investment Initiative. As you mentioned, I'm the Director of Innovative Finance at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Next slide, please. I'm just going to spend the first few minutes giving you a bit of a background on HI4, what it is, why it exists, and then plan to spend the majority of my time speaking about the market-based mechanism and challenges, scaling, et cetera. So we are focused on high-integrity tropical forests. If you think about the tropical forest space, I kind of see it in three buckets. One is this area where it's already been deforested and you're focused on restoration. The second is this avoided deforestation, sort of red plus space. And then the third are these large intact tropical forests that have high levels of biodiversity and are intact. And that's the area that HI4 is focused on. Next slide. So if you take a look across the globe and you look and think about where these areas of large, and when I'm talking about large, it's like 100,000 hectares or greater, intact tropical forests still are. That's mainly the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, and then some small parts of Southeast Asia. And when we talk about ecological integrity, I'm using the metric of the Forest Landscape Integrity Index, or the FLI, and really focus on those high integrity areas. Next slide. So the HI4 initiative was started a few years ago, and it's really focused on the idea of how do you scale financing for these large intact tropical forests. We've up until this point, we've had, financing for these areas that's been insufficient. It's been very focused on philanthropy and, the actual government financing, which has been, inadequate. We're all very well aware of this. It's been incredibly challenging to think about how we scale that. We're very focused on how we provide longer term finance for forest stewards. And just a few stats here, just to, get you to think about, again, the importance of these areas, not just from the biodiversity and carbon, but also from thinking about local and indigenous communities. Next slide. So just to kind of frame it in the larger space, HI4 really sits in between climate and biodiversity. I really think of it as more of a nature finance instrument. As I mentioned, it's not an offset. It is not avoided deforestation. It does not fit in with a REDD project because it doesn't fit in with this idea of additionality as it relates to REDD. When you think about the biodiversity finance space, that's really been broken up into these two areas to date, one focused on uplift and one more focused on nature stewardship. And we do see a large overlap there in terms of maintenance of these areas, not so much in uplift because these areas already have high levels of biodiversity and ecological integrity. Next slide. So there are three main components that the Wildlife Conservation Society is focused on in order to build out a robust initiative. One is developing a methodology. So, if you go to hi4.org, we have our HI4 methodology. It's public, it's in multiple languages, and we've built that out over several years with internal and external experts. We're in the process of thinking about how we build that up to a larger standard. That's going to be incredibly important as you think about building this to scale. The second is projects. So we have some initial projects that I'll mention in the pipeline that we're working on. How do we think about scaling that, not just within WCS, but with partners? And then third, which is most of what my work focuses on, is how do we partner with different institutions to really scale financing for these areas? Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're very focused on these large areas. We've created what's called a HI4 unit. This is an area-based unit. It's focused on a hectare of well-maintained high-integrity tropical forest. We're all very aware of the fact that there are many metrics and many units that are being developed. This is the one that we think works for the HI4 initiative, and we think that it is a fungible unit across tropical forests. Next slide. We have, when you think about a unit and you think about this idea of sort of selling a unit, it's really important to think about what does that mean for the private sector. And so we have a report on our website, and this is just a quick slide to show that we've really thought out what are the claims that can be made. For example, if someone in the private sector or others was interested in purchasing a unit and retiring it. So we've thought about that in terms of biodiversity and carbon conservation. We're monitoring those across all of our work. And then, of course, when you think about land conservation, that's sort of a higher level metric. And we want to be also very attentive to the fact that you need to be looking at wildlife populations as well as the importance to communities. Next slide. So when you think about financial mechanism, I've spent the last 18 months really talking with the private sector, talking with corporates, talking with financial institutions. And what we've really come to feel is that HI4 is the best instrument for attracting capital in the capital market investment, specifically building these relationships with financial institutions and multilateral banks. So as a first step to this, we've been very focused on the idea of creating outcome bonds for our initial projects. Next slide. So this is where we're at to date. So the idea is to start with two initial outcome bonds. The bond model is like the Rhino bond model. So you've got outcome payers that are likely to be corporates, philanthropies, et cetera. We're doing that for our initial two projects in Jau National Park in Brazil and New Bali Nubali and Doki National Park in Republic of Congo. The focus is to start with those and to really think about utilizing the KPIs for those types of bonds around maintenance of high ecological integrity and creation of the high 4 unit. So we're very focused on those two KPIs. And the innovation that we're bringing as through this process, not only is the high 4 unit a KPI, but it'll actually also be created as part of the project and the bond, so that at the end of it, you'll actually have someone within that bond structure that will hold and own the high 4 unit certificate. And we see that as a way to start to build value and creation of that. Of course, we need to think about how we scale that, right? Next slide. So one of the big questions is, who are we working with? How do you do this? We are working with, this is just sort of a quick list of the different institutions. We're working with multilateral banks, private banks, governments, nonprofits, and IPLCs. We have a new project that we're developing in Los Jaguares in the southern part of Colombia that we are designing with indigenous communities. You can imagine, as the Wildlife Conservation Society, it's incredibly important to have all of these different stakeholders engaged as we develop out these projects. Next slide. So here's where we're at as of today. As I mentioned, we have 2 of our initial pilots. We're focusing on looking at that outcome bond that will be issued by multilateral banks. We're working on solidifying outcome payers for both of those. The key part of this, though, is how do we go from those 2 to something that looks like, you may have seen this mom-back deal that was done with the World Bank and Microsoft, where Microsoft was actually the off-taker of the carbon units. So what we're envisioning is, not just the creation of the high 4 units, but off-takers actually of the high 4 units, to really think about how we move this and scale that. And that there's a necessity to then think about, how do you bring corporates into this? What's the business case for them? How do we then drive this to a much larger scale? Next slide. So just some key things to mention in terms of lessons learned. I've been at WCS a year and a half. I spent most of my time talking with private sector, with financial institutions and corporates, multilateral banks, nonprofits, and others, and I've learned a lot. One of the biggest things I've learned is that you really need to work with everyone. You need to be having conversations on the ground. And we're really fortunate at WCS because we have our country offices. They're in country, they're working with communities, they're working with the governments. We have our regional offices, and we also have our global. And so we're able to really pull and work with a diverse range of organizations and entities. And that's been a big part of the interest in putting this together. Of course, lots of challenges. This is new. It's challenging. Corporates, I say a question just popped up about demand. Corporates right now are very focused on within their value chain. That is challenging. These areas are big, they're large, they're intact, and they're basically pretty far away from a lot of the value chains of these different corporates. I would make the case, particularly around water, and around rainfall regulation, if you look at the Amazon, that the intact tropical forest is incredibly critical. And there is science around this to show the importance of the maintenance of rainfall regulation. We're really thinking about how we advance that science to be able to have a conversation with corporates to get them to understand that this is actually within their value chain. They could see a 10%, a 15% decrease in rainfall with the loss of these tropical forests. And that's going to have a huge impact on their business. So that's a key part of it. Another challenge that I'll mention is this, obviously the biodiversity credit market is new, it's small, and our vision is this idea that as we scale and we think about the creation of high 4 units and the ownership, it would eventually need to feed into a larger biodiversity credit market. We're trying to make sure that we're aligned in the methodology and the standard with how the biodiversity credit market is being organized, and the just sort of different umbrella organizations that are looking at the big tenets of that. But that really needs to happen, I think, for this to be successful. And then just some insights. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I spend a lot of my time talking with people, asking questions, being creative, thinking of ideas, and all across the board, people have been incredibly helpful, and it's just been amazing actually to see the support that we've had. And the other thing too is that one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that we can utilize existing financial mechanisms. We can utilize outcome bonds, sustainable linked bonds, green bonds, sustainable linked loans. There are existing financial mechanisms we can use to finance these types of things. We don't need to come up with something super complex and new. We need to work with financial institutions where they're at in the work that they do on a day-to-day basis and figure out how we bring these things together. Last slide, I think. Yep, last slide. So replicability and scalability. So as I mentioned at the beginning, on the supply side, we're in the process of moving from the creation of this methodology to a robust standard. I imagine WCS will not be able to hold that standard. It will certainly need to be a larger standard body. We're starting to think as we build out these pilots and the other parts of it, how do we scale who that standard body might be? Certainly, we will not be successful if all of the HYFOR areas are WCS areas, right? We need to be working with partners, thinking about all the areas in these intact tropical forests in those regions that I mentioned, and how they then start to develop these types of projects. And then again, on the finance piece, there are a few key aspects to this in terms of scaling and replicability. One is, how do you move from some outcome bonds to more of that off-taker model to then something that looks like a financing facility that then is going to need to sit somewhere? Is there a space in which there's resale of HYFOR units, so you start to create more of that demand to be able to scale? And then how do we align with the standardization of the biodiversity credit market? And lastly, I'll just say, I aspire this will be successful. And we've had a lot of questions about like, hey, can we do this for peatlands? We certainly do a lot of work in those areas. And I do see a space in which if this is successful, we could then utilize this for other ecosystems. So that's it. Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat. And here's just some reports that are on our website if you're interested, and happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much to you, Ashley. This was very interesting, very, very interesting, and also I think inspiring for many of the participants. So I won't comment on anything because we have many speakers ahead. But please, if you have questions, I just want to remind that we will have a Q&A session at the end, and that you can also post your questions in the chat. We will discuss them later, but also maybe answer while we go with the next presentations. So now I would like to hand it over to two other speakers that have joined us today. We have Dria Burbank, the CEO of Savimbo, who will be talking about Savimbo case with biodiversity credits and habitat banking. And also we are very lucky to have Fernando Lezama. He's a Taita Pijao indigenous community member and also the co-founder of Savimbo. So the floor is yours. And for participants, just a reminder, if you want to change translation, just click on the icon with the relevant language that you want to listen in. Please, Dria.
Thanks. We're happy to be here presenting for Savimbo. So Savimbo is how to save a planet, not like you should have saved that planet, or why didn't you save that planet, or that person isn't saving a planet, but just step-by-step instructions from Indigenous people and local communities on exactly how to do it. Next. We always make the joke that Savimbo is like if Indigenous peoples and solar punk had a baby. And so it's the most ancient ideas of how humans interact with nature in harmony with the most modern tools and this techno-optimist view of the future. And that's what Savimbo is. Next. Savimbo was founded by three people. So I'm an MD technologist from the hotbed of Silicon Valley. Johnny is a jaguar tracker who was trained by World Wildlife Fund and then went independent. And Fernando is an indigenous shaman and negotiator worked across the Amazon for 20 years. Next. We also work with an independent panel of Indigenous friends. Right now, it's about 99 leaders from 25 countries and 55 nations who give us a counterpoint and a lot of advice and do technical co-design on all of our projects and economics and scientific solutions. Next. We're just going to address 3 points here. So first, we're going to talk about what we've come up with, a description of our biodiversity credit mechanism. Next. So we started our project in this patch of the Colombian Amazon. It's a HYFOR forest. We're on the border of the tropical Andean biodiversity hotspot. And we have a high rate of deforestation where we're at, just like Brazil. The difference is where we're at, Indigenous peoples and local communities are friends and work together. So it took some of the social conflict out of the economic problem of deforestation. Next. Obviously, the Amazon's a big target, 10% of the world's biodiversity, 25% of the world's land carbon is stored there. If it dries out and the local rainfall cycles dry up, then we emit that land carbon into the atmosphere on top of our current emissions, which is a planet killer. So what we're working on is fixing the grassroots economics that drive deforestation. Next. We don't know how to save a forest. We saved our forest last year for $99,000, paid in 1,300 micropayments to 148 families. So we know the exact cost of saving a forest. Next. And we worked out a business model to provide that money in a more fluid way. So we stop deforestation by paying the right people, and then we sell 6 climate products: biodiversity, carbon, water credits, trees planted, agrobiodiversity, and ecotourism. Right now, we're just talking about the biodiversity arm. Next. So here's our biodiversity project. We have the world's first certified biodiversity methodology. It relies on indicator species. This is a photograph of our biodiversity team in the jungle last year. There's 8 indigenous nations represented just on our initial pilot project. Next slide. Our initial pilot project merges collective land ownership with individual land ownership, small farmers. And so next. As I said, we certify with Ser Carbono and ICR. Next slide. Our unit is very similar to the HI4 unit. It's just a little bit more granular in time. So it's 1 month instead of 10 years. Next. Lessons learned. Next. 3 economic lessons that we need to talk about. So the first thing is indigenous people want no strings attached on their economics. Next. So they don't want to sell their land rights to their data, their rights to their land, their rights to their trees, their rights to their biodiversity, or their carbon credits. Rights are not for sale. They don't want any economic colonialism. Next slide. They also have the right to ongoing consent. So those 40-year to 100-year carbon contracts that you see on the market all the time actually don't work in indigenous land. They can cancel them anytime. So it doesn't work for either the Western world or the indigenous world. Next slide. The last thing, and sorry, next 2 more. Next slide. There we go. Last thing is mango versus tree. So we say this all the time, mango versus tree. Indigenous people are super happy to sell their mangoes on the open market. They don't want to sell the trees that produce the mangoes. And that's the simple metaphor that we use all the time when we're talking to people to distinguish economic colonialism and investment from great trade. Next slide. I'm going to pass it off. I'm going to pass it off to Fernando. So, well, and actually, I think we're still good on time. So really quickly, we're going to talk about scalability internationally. Next slide. These are all the different indigenous projects that have joined. We have about 22 to 50 indigenous projects interested in joining, and it's mostly across the equator. Next slide. Once again, we're talking about the unit and how we interoperate, and the reason that we move so fast, next slide, is because our unit interoperates for conservation biodiversity. Next slide. Restoration biodiversity. Next slide. Another kind of restoration that doesn't look, just looks at the uplift. Next slide. It works for impact metrics. We're working on it, but it basically directly correlates with just impact. Next slide. And it also works for avoided impact, which incentivizes corporates to join the market and fund it. Next slide. I'm going to turn the mic over to Fernando, who's going to give the indigenous perspective. Make sure that you guys are on the English translation because I'll be speaking in Spanish.
Sí, muy buenas para todos. Mi nombre es Fernando, cofundador de Savimbo. Savimbo es una empresa que tiene historia, ¿no? Es conformada con pensamiento indígena, con las comunidades indígenas, conciencia indígena, para atender todas las soluciones desde los territorios, desde las comunidades locales e indígenas. Y entonces así, digamos, se ha hecho, digamos, como un gran trabajo con esta metodología que se puede replicar muy fácilmente, ¿no? En cualquier país. Hemos estado en Panamá con los Embera de Panamá, los Guaunán, varios compañeros en Ecuador, los Cofanes, también parte, digamos, de la Amazonía en Brasil y también estamos trabajando en Bolivia. Es un mecanismo que se hizo, digamos, para trabajar con todo lo que tiene que ver con temas de biodiversidad, para poder aportar, digamos, a la humanidad, al planeta, el tema de conservación. Eso es como la metodología más precisa que nosotros creemos, digamos, desde los territorios, hablando con muchos líderes indígenas y también con líderes campesinos, que ellos creen que es la manera, digamos, de poder de entrar al mercado de biodiversidad, que los recursos lleguen directamente a las comunidades. Entonces ahí hay algo que se hizo, que Sabimbo construyó, que se llama Capital, que es un sistema de pagos para que el dinero no se pierda, porque nosotros creemos que ese es el problema, digamos, de la financiación, que el dinero no llega donde tiene que llegar, sino se va todo en burocracia, papeles, todo se vuelve como espuma en las ciudades, digamos, se vuelve, digamos, como en las ciudades cogen el dinero y nunca llega a los territorios, sino siempre llegan unos programas que no benefician, digamos, a los campesinos, y eso es lo que nos obligan, digamos, nosotros y a los indígenas, pues, a tener una forma de subsistir y acabar, digamos, con lo que es como los recursos naturales por la subsistencia, ¿no? Entonces, este modelo, digamos, que se creó y se ha planteado, digamos, ha sido, digamos, como un modelo perfecto para la conservación en las comunidades, y las personas pueden trabajar, digamos, en el territorio, porque nosotros creemos que la tecnología puede ahorrarnos una cantidad, digamos, de, por ejemplo, montar en las ciudades oficinas o una cantidad de logística que se requiere. Yo creo que hoy en día con la tecnología se puede, digamos, trabajar directamente y se puede ver la trazabilidad de lo que es pues los recursos, ¿no? Entonces, en eso es lo que le estamos apostando nosotros, y también pues es importante lo que hace Sabimbo, digamos, porque, por ejemplo, Sabimbo está enfocado también no solamente en la pérdida de biodiversidad, sino también en lo que ya casi no tenemos. Por ejemplo, en la selva tenemos un árbol que se llama espingo, que está en vía de extinción, y nosotros con las comunidades hemos identificado, con científicos también se trabaja, digamos, con los datos indígenas, y también es otro punto que se debe trabajar, es como guardar los datos indígenas, que haya soberanía de datos y todo lo que tiene que ver en el empoderamiento de las culturas de los pueblos milenarios, porque pues para nosotros es importante la lengua indígena, y también importante, digamos, como dejarle un buen planeta a las próximas generaciones. Ese es como el lema de vida de las comunidades, pero también algo muy importante que yo creo que no se toca, digamos, en los espacios, es que la humanidad debe dar derechos a la naturaleza. Es algo muy importante que la naturaleza también tenga unos derechos. Muchas gracias.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you guys can follow us on Twitter, TikTok. There's more photos.
Great. Yes, I'm sure our participants will be very interested in following your work and your activities. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and also your direct involvement of indigenous leaders and local communities in your projects. There are some questions in the chat. Again, we will have a Q&A at the end. Speakers, feel free to answer if you would like to already. We can now go to the next speaker, who is Oliver Withers. He's the head of nature at Standard Chartered. And in this presentation, he will focus on the Bahamas Depth Conservation Project as a case study, and he will illustrate the potential of depth-based solutions. And before I give the floor, just a kind reminder, we are doing live interpretation, so please speak slowly so we can allow for interpretation. And yes, Oliver, the floor is yours. You have around 10 minutes for presenting. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I could somebody to take us to hopefully the next slide, which will be something I'm familiar with. Perfect, thank you. First of all, just a really big thank you to the Savimbo team for the images that you put up there. For those of you that are not aware, Standard Chartered is a global bank. For me, sitting inside a global bank, trying to mobilize finance for nature, sometimes we can forget what nature looks like and why we're doing this. So it was wonderful to see those images coming straight from the Amazon, and a strong reminder for all of us why we are on this call and why we're trying to do the work that we do. So, as I mentioned, I'm from Standard Chartered Bank. We are a London-listed bank, but we operate in 53 of the world's most dynamic and emerging markets. So, despite being based in London, we see emerging markets where some of the richest biodiversity and nature in the world is as our real home markets. And for the firm, nature is very much a key focus, and delighted to say as well that not just broad nature, but we have an explicit focus on oceans as well, acknowledging that this is a significantly underfunded space and often neglected in terms of interventions. If we go to the next slide, please. So as the host alluded to, I'm here to talk to you about the Bahamas Debt Conversion Project for Marine Conservation. This was closed and completed in November last year. And we are really, really proud of this. And I think I caught a bit of Ashley's talk earlier. And I think it really echoes some of the comments that Ashley made around we don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel all the time. We can evolve financial products to suit and serve our interests. And that is certainly what has happened when we look at debt conversions, or as some people call them, debt swaps. So it's important to remember that the very first debt swaps were done in the late 80s. And those originally were simple bilateral debt swaps. So was a sovereign to a sovereign that was negotiating and concluding that swap. And crudely, the swap was a lender nation writing off a portion of the debt that is owed to it by the borrower country in exchange for some sort of commitment to nature. And what we have seen since the late 80s is that this instrument has evolved quite significantly. And I will make sure that I address the topics of replicability and scalability but at the end. But I do want to just preface what I'm about to say with, again, acknowledging that this is an evolution of trades that were done originally in the 80s. And this is evidence in and of itself of the replicability and the scalability of this approach. And I'm delighted to say we are seeing further replication and scaling occurring going forward. So the Bahamas debt swap or debt conversion, as I said, it's not a completely new instrument or approach. Crudely, what happens is that we, as Standard Chartered Bank, have provided a $300 million loan to the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Now, we are very, very lucky in that we have very forward-looking and forward-thinking institutions that have partnered with us on this transaction. First of all, the Nature Conservancy, who have acted as a catalyst for this trade to happen, have led the negotiations around the conservation elements. And that's really, really important for a financial institution, because we should not be making conservation judgment calls as a bank. We need to partner with institutions that are leaders on the topics of conservation and be led by them. Also, very, very importantly, is our $300 million loan is backed, if you will, by credit enhancement providers. And in particular, we have a $200 million loan from the Inter-American Development Bank. We've got 70 million of collateralized guarantees from Builders Vision, which is a Lucas Walton impact platform and essentially a family office. And we've got $30 million of credit insurance from AXA XL. So that gives us total 300 million cover on the 300 million loan. Now, why is that important? It's important because that credit enhancement package allows us to price the loan at a very, very competitive interest rate. Such a competitive interest rate that when we compare it to the existing debt that the government of the Bahamas is facing, we're able to use that $300 million loan to buy out a whole lot of their existing debt that is at a much more expensive interest rate. So by doing this, we're able to generate savings for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, right? And as part of the quid pro quo for the credit enhancement providers providing this credit enhancement, there is an agreement with the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas that the transaction savings will be allocated to a conservation trust fund. Now, that conservation trust fund, I'm delighted to say in the case of the Bahamas, already existed. It's the Bahamas Protected Area Fund. And so we are leveraging, in this case, existing infrastructure that already exists. And crudely, it is expected that this transaction is going to generate around about 124 million US dollars of savings over the life of the facility, 15 years. And that full 124 million US dollars will be channeled into the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund, which is, as I mentioned, a trust fund with its own separate governance structure. That governance structure has representation from the government, from the some of the credit enhancement providers, from the Nature Conservancy, but also very importantly from civil society stakeholder groups as well. That $124 million of savings that goes into the trust fund will then be allocated into a series of conservation interventions that relate to ocean and marine conservation. First and foremost, very, very importantly, is how can we use that money to enable the government of the Bahamas to effectively manage the very, very large protected area network that they already have in place today. We want to ensure, where possible, that we're avoiding simply paper parks, but actually that those parks or those designated marine protected areas have sufficient funding to be effectively managed. An absolutely critical step of all of this is obviously a marine spatial plan. Bahamas as a island nation is highly dependent on its blue economy. That means that there are competing interests for those blue economy resources. And the marine spatial planning process, which is a consultative process informed by science, ensures that all different blue economy stakeholders have a say in how those blue resources of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas are used in future. Also, very importantly, for the Bahamas, they have included a mangrove management plan that forms part of their NDCs. And that, needless to say, is critical in terms of climate mitigation, but also adaptation. And then it will be no surprise to the audience on this call, the co-benefits that we realize from these types of interventions include for biodiversity and species, but also for adaptation value and for local livelihoods. And that's a really important attribute of this as well, is that we have to ensure that we are accommodating for local communities and their existing livelihood channels. And this cannot be at odds with that. So from a conservation perspective, we are delighted with the results of this transaction. As I say, $300 million loan generating $124 million of cash flow that will be dedicated into marine conservation. Just want to highlight a couple of key attributes around the structure. So it's the first full debt conversion for nature that we as Standard Chartered have done, and we are certainly looking to replicate and scale this approach. It is also very importantly the first time we've seen a family office come into a transaction like this and provide credit enhancement. We think that that's a really important signal to other family offices globally, that they can play a critical role in unlocking trades like this that generate significant cash flows for conservation. Similarly, AXA XL, this is the first time that we have seen a private insurance company come front and center within one of these trades. Historically, they have done some reinsurance in the background, but this is a reflection of the insurance industry's comfort and growing comfort with the debt swap market. And this really is, as we see it, a really strong endorsement for this approach to trying to address the triple crisis that we see in so many emerging and developing markets of significant debt burdens that sovereigns are facing, significant costs of climate change, and also rapidly declining nature stocks. Also, very, very importantly for the Bahamas itself, this is the first time that the Bahamas has integrated some sort of parametric insurance. This is really, really important aspect of this transaction because what it means is that for the Bahamas, if they face a significant climate event, that they have some protection around that event, and the parametric insurance creates some breathing room for them in order to continue servicing that debt, and it doesn't immediately result in a default on the debt itself. So really, really important in terms of protecting the Bahamas, and by protecting the Bahamas, we're also ultimately protecting investors. And then the last piece is just this integration of what we would refer to as climate smart marine protected area commitments. And so as much as obviously historically there's been an explicit focus on conserving biodiversity in marine protected areas, also a significant thinking around how we can really maximize climate outcomes from smart marine protected areas as well. Next slide, please. I will very quickly talk you through the structure. So as I mentioned earlier, Standard Chartered provides a $300 million loan to the government of the Bahamas. This loan is benefiting from credit enhancement from Inter-American Development Bank, Builders Vision, and XL. That allows us to price that loan at a very competitive rate. The government then uses the proceeds of that loan to buy its existing commercial debt out. It targets the most expensive insurance debt that is sitting on the government's books, all with the intent of trying to maximize the amount of savings that can be generated through that trade. And then ultimately, the government agrees to make predefined conservation payments into the Conservation Trust Fund over the life of the 15-year facility. Each year, the savings that are realized are channeled into that Conservation Trust Fund. There is an endowment component to the Conservation Trust Fund as well, so that at the end of 15 years, there is an endowment that then kicks in, and touch wood, assuming that that endowment achieves the intended return profile, it will then be able to service grant making into marine conservation projects on an ongoing basis once this trade matures after 15 years. Another really important design principle around these structures and how they've evolved, really trying to ensure permanence of the sustainability impact once the term of this product ends. So all in all, really, really chuffed for ourselves to have been involved in this trade. But I think we really need to applaud the Inter-American Development Bank, who have been a critical component of so many of the debt swaps that have been done. In terms of replicability and scalability, what we really need is more credit enhancement that's available. We need more multilateral development banks to follow IADB's suit here and look at providing guarantees to catalyze these trades. Again, huge shout out to Lucas Walton and the Builders Vision team that we see a family office stepping in and playing a role like this in catalyzing these types of trades. We really need to see more family offices stepping up if we're going to enable that replication and scaling. And similarly, all kudos to AXA XL for being willing to come front and center as a private insurer on trades like this. And I expect that the friendly nature of private sector competition, my hope is that we will see an abundance of other insurance companies wanting to play this role in the future as well. So that credit enhancement piece, really, really critical. I mentioned the role of TNC. This trade does not happen without the likes of the Nature Conservancy really driving it forward. It's absolutely critical when we talk about what the nature commitments, targeted impact is, that's being driven by conservation partners and not by a financial institution. We should not be making judgment calls on what good conservation looks like. So we need more TNCs in this world that are out there working with sovereigns to drive these processes forward. I think that it's very clear that there is a real growing interest from the institutional investor community for more nature-related assets. And so in many cases, these transactions would be sold down to institutional investors eventually. I think that there is a very strong, robust demand for these types of assets from that investor community. And then really the final and most important piece of the puzzle is the sovereigns themselves, right? The sovereigns are the ones that are sitting on the commercial debt, right? But also it's the sovereigns themselves that are the custodians of that natural capital. And so it's really, really important that sovereigns recognize an opportunity. This type of approach is not fit for every single country. It's not a silver bullet. But we really encourage sovereigns where the environment is right to pursue these types of transactions. And that requires really strong alignment between ministries of finance and ministries of environment. And, you know, I think that in many cases, what we have seen is that these trades have actually forged very strong relationships between ministries of finance and ministries of environment. And I like to believe that the co-benefits that we are realizing through that improved relationship and understanding of one another's realms extends far beyond the impact of just these transactions. I will stop there, acknowledging time is tight, and look forward to any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oliver, really for this very, very insightful and interesting presentation, also bringing the perspective of conserving the marine landscape, which is super important. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, which is Fei Lan. She's the Biofin China National Coordinator at the UNDP, and she will focus on payments for ecosystem services. Also, around 10 minutes for you, Fei. Thank you.
Thank you, Aura, for your introduction. And I think I'm sharing here today is about the PS payment for ecosystem services. One of the common use solutions that, but in China has done a lot on PS, and UNDP has a market-based case that I will introduce later. In China, PS actually has included in the framework of eco-compensation. China issued the regulations on ecological protection compensation in 2024, and also issued some other corresponding policies. They characterized this in three types: vertical eco-compensation and horizontal eco-compensation. These two are more likely to like the ecological fiscal transfer. And third is the market-based eco-compensation. We call it payment for ecosystems. Next slide. The compensation system in China can be traced back to 1998 and start with an initiative to return farmland to forest and grassland. So the latest regulations aim to consolidate past experience and practices and try to have an eco-compensation version 2. And we can see they increase they increase the compensation over the years and increased a lot from 2013 to 2023, and some of the compensation doubled. Next slide. And some highlights of this regulation is that first, they are trying to synergy the integrated and categorize the compensation. In these regulations, it offers the different ways. I will show you later. The second highlight to be is that the compensation has been extended to the village level. after long run demonstration since 1998, it can be implemented through various forms of compensation. And third to be highlighted is that the regulation provides an incentive and penalty mechanism. For instance, the allocation result of relevant transfer payments funds were closely linked to the equal compensation and performance and other like the certificate and other instruments. Next slide. And I will briefly go through these two kinds of mechanism. First, the vertical equal compensation, and the vertical compensation is like a top-down solution. And so it's mainly implemented through the fiscal transfer payment from the national level government to the provincial or local level government. But in the latest policy, it goes deep down to the county and the village level. The central government will support the exact field like the forest, grassland, water, etc. And meanwhile, the central government will also provide payments to the integrated landscape, such as the key ecological function areas or zone, and also has implemented transfer payments to the area within the eco redlining. And some areas construction is prohibited and partly restricted within this area. This main function zone will also get the payment. In China, all these protected area and especially the nature reserves are covered by environmental redlining. Next slide. About the horizontal equal compensation, maybe we can introduce later in the future if we have time. So I will directly introduce, first, the horizontal equal compensation is like the between different regions, especially from the downstream to upstream. And one of the cases is in Xiayang River Basin. The upstream village enhance the ecological protection efforts, while the downstream village can carry out ecotourism. And downstream residents provide compensation or payments to the upstream villages, which result in the water's quality's improvement. And at the beginning in 2012, the downstream water quality of Qiandao Lake was classified as class 4 or even worse. But after this mechanism implementation, it improved to class 2 and maintained at that level. And compensation agreements between government, downstream, and upstream could be signed. And in such agreements, it should be achieved a consensus on the scope, proper goals and indicators, M&E plan, responsibility of each parties, and payment methods, durations, and other arrangements. And to be highlighted is that it should fully consider the development status of the protected areas or upstreams, and the development status and the biodiversity or status of nature, and the cost of this transfer, effectiveness and the capacity of the protected area to achieve the goal, and also the capacity of the downstream, whether it's affordable. So maybe such a mechanism can be further transferred as a simple and domestic debt for nature swaps. Next slide. As we know that PS occur when the beneficiaries and users of an ecosystem services make payments to the providers of that service. So it's a voluntary transaction, which is between an ecosystem services buyer and an ecosystem service provider. So it's that we can see in that Chinese market-based eco-compensation is similar to the PS. And the regulations has some highlights here, and yeah, you can see. And I would like to see is that in this regulation, they want to that engage multi-stakeholders and especially the residents in rural area, and they are planning to create a participatory benefits sharing mechanism. Next slide. UNDP implemented a PS project from 2014 to 2019, named Payment for Watershed Services in Chishui River Basin for conservation of global significant biodiversity. In China, along Yangtze River, the Chishui River is the only free flow Yangtze River Basin without a dam. It's also the protected habitat for rare fish and rich resources of biodiversity. Some of you might heard the most famous alcohol in China, Maotai alcohol. And Maotai County is a center of alcohol production areas because of the high quality of the water and the special bacteria and yeast there. And they also use the traditional knowledge and culture to produce this alcohol. And UNDP developed the project together with the Ministry of Ecology and Environment to implement a PS project there. And different parties have different concerns and demands. The downstream companies need high quality and enough quantity of water. So it requires the resident of upstream should adopt and uptake the biodiversity and friendly landscape use options, which might cause benefit loss due to the prohibition of use of the fertilizers and pesticides, and then sacrifice their production and income. Next slide. During the project implementation, we will provide capacity building. No, we provided the capacity building for both managers and raise the awareness of payment PS to the local communities, introduce the local NGO to manage this process. The project facilitated the agreement signing between the local communities and the alcohol companies. During the project implementation, Maotai announced that they would provide compensation of about $71 million. It's a joint effort, and the fund were not just for the community, but it's a very good beginning. UNDP and local government step out later afterwards, and you can find that relevant news that still the mechanism is still working, and ADB keep working on that, and the company Maotai also established, and other companies established a Chishui River Ecological Public Welfare Fund recently. Actually, in China, it's still very hard to find a market-based eco-compensation or payment for ecosystem services cases, and because that can last long. Like this case, the Maotai alcohol need high quality of water and continuous needs, and also need people like to drink water, alcohol. So PS should be signed or designed case by case. Next slide. The lessons learned. And China has practices a lot of solutions and is processing them. Really, we can hear a lot of achievements there. But today, I like to want to share more about lessons learned from that. That's from UNDP, from Biofin side. We would like to work with government and private sector to improve this PS or a fiscal transfer to generate better results. First is that the appropriate indicator setting is quite important in the ecological transfer, fiscal transfer, and also the PS project. A target on biodiversity should be involved. Currently, you will find that it might be water quality and some indicators. So, but the biodiversity indicator should be needed in the future. Monitor the efficiency and effectiveness of such PS project is also needed. And the indicators should, third one is the indicators should be involved in design phase, implementation, and reporting process and M&E process. Really, we have a good view, but if we might fail without proper implementation. So it might cost spending money, but implement the project in a benefit in a biodiversity negative way. And so we need to monitor that. 4 is that we need to leave more room to have the flexibility and make the adaptation accordingly. And 5, if you are applying for GF projects, you know that in GF-8, the integrated approach and systematic way of thinking will be much welcome. 6 is that we need to fully consult indigenous people before your implementation. In China, it's the same. We need to fully consult with minorities and relevant agencies and NGOs. 7 is that ecological enabling approach that mentioned in the regulation. It's good, and it's good to trace and disclose in the future. Let's see. And furthermore, we would like to work with the government and the institutions, organizations in the future to generate more cases in the future. Looking forward to find opportunity to work with you all. Over. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Faye, really for sharing the China example, also sharing lessons learned. This is always very precious, and also next step for action. So with this last presentation, I think we can go ahead with a live Q&A session. So we have been receiving some questions in the chat that we have noted down, thanks also to the support of my colleagues. But I would like to ask the participants if there is anyone who would maybe like to take the floor and ask questions directly. You can raise your hand. Otherwise, I would maybe start with the first question that I think was not answered in the chat. This was for Ashley. There was this question from Ella de Blois, who asked, what's the appetite demand for HYFOR units at the moment? And by the way, also thanks to the speaker for already answering to many of the questions. I've seen you were very active in the chat.
Sure. Most of my answers are I don't know. But yeah, so I think the way that we've been thinking about this is that the HYFOR unit doesn't exist. We need to make it exist. And I think the best way to do that is to take a step back and look at how we create value and create its existence through these outcome bonds. That's been, I think, so far a really good way forward. We've had some financial institutions that we've had conversations with, a multitude, and I think that they're very excited about the opportunity to think about, again, utilizing these outcome bonds. We've seen it for the rhinos, we've seen other types of species bonds, but then I'll innovate a bit on that, right, by using the HYFOR unit within that. So I think that's a great opportunity. We've had some great support from the multilateral. So I feel like we're in a good situation with that sort of first piece of it. That next step where we go from that towards the scaling and the corporate off-takers is hard. I've had some good conversations with companies that have a big dependence on water, that have a big dependence on, like I mentioned earlier, water regulation, rainfall. There's definitely an understanding of the importance. The science is there, maybe not as much as they want. I don't know that we're ever going to get it there. We will see how that works. And so it's really figuring out who are the corporates that are, obviously not just dependent on these areas, but also are at the forefront of this conversation. They exist, right? There are definitely corporates that are out there that are really excited about the biodiversity credit market. They're pushing the agenda. And so I think that there is a small appetite on the corporate side. I think it will grow as there's new data. We, understand more of these dependencies. And I think that information is changing really quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ashley. And indeed, scalability, that's the fun part, right? How to make things scalable and replicable. I would like to ask the next question that was from the chat. This is for Dria or Fernando. So Elizabeth asked how is it ensured that through these financing mechanisms, no debt is generated for indigenous communities?
Sorry, no debt. What's generated for indigenous communities?
Yeah, so no debt. And if Elizabeth, you would.
No debt.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So we use the same thing that HighFor does. So we do outcomes-based crediting. So they've already done the work and then they're just selling the outcome for the credit. And we are, most of our products are commodities. In other words, it's kind of like a mango falling off a tree. Mango it can be transported across borders. It can be sold a number of times and then it expires. And the same thing goes for our biodiversity credits. We also do forward financing with a no strings attached recoverable grant mechanism, and I'll drop the contract in, but essentially you can take in private or public financing, but it leaves no strings whatsoever for the community. The last thing is we made our methodology incredibly simple and easy for communities to execute. So in contrast to a carbon project, which costs about $80,000 and takes 3 years to implement, ours takes communities 2 days to train, $10,000 to implement, and they're releasing credits within 6 months. And that was some crazy scientific activism.
Thank you, Gia, for answering to these questions. I'm just gonna go through quickly just to make sure that we try to answer to all the questions live. There was another one for Oliver this time from Walter. He asked if it's possible to know the cost-benefit analysis of the intervention and the cost effectiveness of the intervention. Oliver, we don't hear you.
I'm not sure in what context we're referring to the intervention, whether it's the $124 million that goes into the Conservation Trust Fund and will be deployed into marine conservation activities, or the overall debt swap transaction itself. I mean, in terms of the cost benefit analysis, you see that crudely reflected in the savings that are generated. And so for the government of the Commonwealth of Bahamas, they are immediately realizing from a pure economics perspective a lower cost of capital because of that credit enhancement package, and that is what is a key driver of generating those savings. So from a pure economic perspective, there are savings generated. For the government of the Bahamas, as I mentioned, there was already a conservation trust fund in place, the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund. And so in that case, it was already, if you will, sunken infrastructure costs that had already been deployed. And so there is no additional costs that have been picked up through that process. And so in the Bahamas case, actually, we view this as a very cost-effective transaction. On some of the previous trades, there has been a requirement to set up the necessary governance, trust funds, etc., and that can add additional costs. Further to which, it's important to note that this was a loan directly from Standard Chartered's balance sheet to the Commonwealth of Bahamas. And so that is the interest rate that Standard Chartered charged. In some of the debt swap transactions, this has ultimately actually been repackaged, the loan, and distributed ultimately to investors, institutional investors. In some of those cases, that does result in a slightly higher interest rate in order to capture those institutional investors. But you need that once you start getting into very, very large figures. And so when we start talking about the kind of scope for scalability, we have now started seeing trades over $1 billion of debt being restructured. And once you start talking those numbers, it really lends itself to distributing the product to institutional investors. And as I mentioned, we we are also very aware that institutional investors have a growing demand for nature assets. And so they are delighted to be able to participate in these transactions as well. In terms of the cost benefit analysis associated with the actual conservation interventions, to be quite blunt, time will tell, because the $124 million of savings is generated over the life of the 15-year loan. There is very robust monitoring, reporting, and verification that is attached to the Conservation Trust Fund, and which the Conservation Trust Fund will provide into the public domain. So it is all very transparent as to the impact that is being delivered through the deployment of those savings. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver, for your very detailed explanation. We have 2 more minutes and we still have some questions. Maybe just one last question for Faye this time. So we cover almost all the speakers. But yeah, if you can be brief in your answer, then I think we will be closing. But there was this question from Zorika, who said China case mentioned payments for ecosystem services. How did you monetize those services that are rarely expressed in financial terms, such as prevention of floods, purification of water, air, conserving biodiversity, etc., if you used a specific methodology? And yeah, if you can kindly be brief in your answer. We may be able to provide a Q&A document at the end. So we will maybe check in with our speakers in case some questions were not answered right now.
Okay, thanks. And I think, in China, they are developing the GEP, and it's another kind of evaluate the development and also the value, the services and also the biodiversity's value. So, but it's also hard to usually it might be quite high or lower. So it depends on the indicators index or something else. It's quite objective. So I mean, this is also in process, and that China is also in developing this kind of methodologies to better monitor and monitorize these services. So maybe they can be also another version 2, as I said, to manage this. But currently, it's only the fiscal transfer to support this kind of like the flow or air control and the water pollution, etc. So currently, it's only the government efforts. Now, maybe in the future, we can be more character accurate on this figure. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Faye. And I think really it was a great conversation, a great session. I think we, all of us maybe have still a lot of questions because we heard many inspiring and insightful stories. But yes, with that, we have finally reached the end of the session. So I would like to thank you all for your time and participation in today's webinar. We have explored I won't try to summarize, but maybe just go through quickly what we discussed. We have explored, of course, the need to mobilize finance through innovative mechanism to fill the finance gap. We heard from Nonde, who shared this case and experience in Zambia, Ashley, who focused on outcome bonds and the HI4 unit, Bria and Fernando on the biodiversity credits case in Colombia, and Oliver on debt conservation on marine, conservation project. And finally, Faye, who provided an overview on market-based ecosystem compensation, focusing on vertical and horizontal compensation. There are many lessons learned. I grasped a few that I think were cross-country. I think there is a strong need to really work together across different sectors, even within government, across different ministries. There is no need to reinvent the wheel, but we can build on existing mechanisms, just make them efficient, make them work. And of course, also there is a need to accommodating for local communities using also an integrated and systemic approaches. So it was very insightful and inspiring. I'm sure the audience also received plenty of ideas on next step to achieve our finance goal through public-private finance, but also keeping in mind, of course, our final objective, which is in the end to protect nature and make nature thrive. Before concluding this meeting, also I would like to express again thank really to the GEF for providing the support for this project, and also to our partners at UNEP-FI, at UNDP, at the Green Finance Institute, and also the CPD Secretariat for all the joint work on this project. Just a reminder for everyone, the recording, presentations, and Q&A documents of this webinar and previous webinar are available on the webinar page, which my colleague will be dropping in the chat. And stay tuned because as part of the series, we are already organizing a next session on the 24th of April. This will focus on the topic of community and indigenous stewardship in revenues generation for nature. So we will send you further information by email as soon as the information are ready. Last but not least, at the end of the session, you will receive a quick survey, which will take really less than a minute to respond, and we really appreciate your feedback. This will ensure we continue offer quality webinars, also reflecting your needs. And I think that's it. If you have any questions for also our speakers, we are happy to redirect them to our speaker. You can reach us to the email indicated on screen. And I guess my last remark is we have the finance goal, we have the means. So now let's all work together to make nature thrive. Thank you so much again to everyone and to our speakers that joined today.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.